Growing Up on a Farm in Kentucky. Stories by Stan Schmidt. Episode 15, Mr. Fraser and Mr. Housley.
There was another man that worked for a couple of other men that worked for my dad that lived in the house above the barn. And one was Mr. Housley. He was a white guy who was a coal miner all his life, and when he retired, he needed a job and needed a house. And he had a family. He had a son that was a farmer who would come by and visit him. And then there was another man who was a black man. His name was Fraser, and he lived there for a while too. But he was an alcoholic. And the stories that came from what we learned from those two is that some days they would work side by side all day in the field, shucking corn or whatever they had, plowing, disking, harrowing, whatever. Other days they would be working closer together, like when you're shucking corn, you're pretty close together. And you can talk and tell stories while you're working. And they would get in arguments. It was an example of prejudice that we saw early on in life and saw up close. And sometimes they would start shoving one another around, and my dad had to break them up. And, well, I guess my dad thought he would do a good deed. He invited them both for lunch at our house, and Mother cooked food for them, and Dad invited them to come into the kitchen and sit down at the dinner table. In those days, the dinner table was in the kitchen, a big kitchen. And Mr. Housley would not sit down at the same table if a black man was sitting there. If Beard Fraser was sitting there, he would not come in to the house to eat a free lunch. And he wanted Beard Fraser to eat outside. And that was the first time I noticed a real prejudice. The fighting was like, we did that as kids ourselves. That seemed normal. It didn't seem prejudicial, and they never really said a lot of things negatively about one another's race or anything like that. But when he wouldn't sit down at the table, then you knew there was something. And you saw, at a young age, you saw an example of prejudice. But I think that was the only... There were a lot of blacks in Jeffersontown, and they pretty much kept to themselves. But that was the first example of prejudice that I saw, but it wasn't real severe like stories you read about in the paper or see on TV nowadays.
Did anyone ever yell at your dad for employing Mr. Beard?
No. It was common for farmers to hire blacks or whites, as long as the person was a good worker. That was pretty much true, I think, all over the South once they got used to paying them instead of not paying them.